The psychedelic revolution is here. If you want to integrate your visionary experiences into your purpose, get clear on your entrepreneurial path, and help people while you do what you love, then this podcast is for you. Welcome to The Psychedelic Entrepreneur, Medicine for These Times. I'm your host, Beth Weinstein. I'm a spiritual business coach, 3-time entrepreneur, and a lifelong student of psychedelics and sacred plant medicines. You carry your own unique medicine, and your medicine is what we need for these times. This podcast will help you to share your medicine so you can create transformation in the world. Listen in on conversations with psychedelic leaders, changemakers, and conscious entrepreneurs who are living proof that a better world is possible when you follow your heart and live in alignment with your soul. Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm so honored to have my friend and neighbor, Allison Hoots, with us today. Hi, Allison. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Beth. It's been a long time coming.
I know, right? It's been a while. I've been trying to get you and other attorneys onto the show, and I'm really excited because this is one of these subjects that so many people are interested in hearing about, and I'm sure you've seen this increase in interest over the years, but we'll get into it. Let me just tell you about Allison. So Allison Hoots is an attorney with Hoots Law Practice PLLC. She has had a diverse experience practicing law, including the legal areas of employment, corporate, contract, employee benefits, tax, and intellectual property. Allison advises companies, nonprofits, religious communities, and practitioners on operations that involve psychedelics, including advising churches on religious use of sacraments. Allison is also president of Sacred Plant Alliance Incorporated, a self-regulating organization and professional society of spiritual practitioners with religious communities dedicated to the advancement of the ceremonial use of psychedelic sacraments within the United States. She's a member of Chacruna's Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants and the lead author of Chacruna's Guide to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and Best Practices for Psychedelic Plant Medicine Churches. So, Allison, I always knew you were an attorney when I met you, and knew you from within the grand interwoven web of the medicine world. But I would love to hear, what got you onto the path of going into law in the first place, and then how did you come to the medicine world or the psychedelic world?
Well, I was indoctrinated. Both my parents are lawyers. Grew up in the DC suburbs, sort of inevitable. But I always loved to analyze things. I was like a murder mystery fanatic as a kid. I always liked to figure things out. So I found that the law, after an English Lit major, made a lot of sense. I like to read. I like to write. I like to analyze and question. I grew up in a Jewish home. Lots of questioning, encouraged and accomplished in the house. And just decided law school was the logical next step, which is funny because I got in trouble a lot as a kid. Really liked to question authority, and found this was a way to do so, and thought I was going to be a litigator. Ultimately found that I was too empathetic to be a litigator, and switched to transactional law. I did entertainment law first. I did employment law. I did employee benefits, some corporate work. And ultimately, after really being miserable for a long time, I ended up at, finally like an AM 100 law firm, which is, like top law firm, and hated my day to day. And I ended up thoroughly destroying my back for a variety of reasons, disability I have, and sitting too much, and, studying too much really. And I had to start therapy, and I was in pain, and I ended up having a massage with my neighbor in West Philadelphia, and she had medicine music playing, and I said, "This is amazing. what is this? And she said, I'm going to send you somewhere. And she did. She sent me to an ayahuasca church. And I kind of want to say it. And here I am now. But basically, that's what happened is I started to attend an ayahuasca church in the depths of my pain and misery and really connected with this community. Ended up working with them. I think this was back in 2015 I met them. And by 2016, I was helping them run it and learning about how do you operate a psychedelic church with the rights that are guaranteed under the law and with certain precedent that existed. And I started to deep dive. Next thing I knew, I was getting referrals. I had a couple churches I was working with. And then I found Chacruna, the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines, and got friendly there, joined their council, wrote a book about it. And it really, acknowledging my privilege that I was able to do all these things. But really, it just flowed in a way. I almost couldn't fight it. It just happened. Next thing I knew, I was a psychedelic lawyer, right? And there's a psychedelic bar association, and I've written a book, and I'm part of the council for Chacruna, and I'm running a nonprofit, talking about psychedelic churches' rights and obligations and how to create accountability systems. So, yeah, just one of those things.
I love these stories. I love these stories where it's like, I believe it's the soul, spirit just pulling you in a direction where it's like, how did I end up here? Especially with the medicine path. I get it. I go through this a lot where I'm like, oh my God, I did not know when I was basically fed a hit of acid at the age of 14 that I would be here today. Like, no idea. Oh, but I love that. I love that story.
If you backtrack and you look at my recreational experiences, that's very relevant too to the work that I do now, because I even, aside from the spiritual use and religious rites, I also work with people who are providing journey support. And I also work with, some people call harm reduction or risk reduction service supporters. And ultimately, every bad trip I've ever had, and there were a lot, has informed the way that I talk about how to provide emergency services to somebody. When do you call an emergency service that is not you, right? When do you call 911? What do you do to make sure that someone is safe? Because I've seen what wasn't safe. I've been there, I've done that, which makes me pretty well educated in the grand scheme of what is reality for these kinds of providers, right? From therapeutic to non-therapeutic, just support, to spiritual practices. I've done it all, and it really helps inform what I do, helps me figure out where the risks are, helps me anticipate those for the participant and the practitioner, right? Because in my work, I really try to help both, right? And some people talk about an informed consent agreement as the way that a practitioner is able to have a person release all of their rights. But it's informed consent, right? This is an opportunity for the participant to be informed enough to realize that there are inherent risks and they have to waive them. There's really no way for the practitioner to diminish all risks. So in knowing what the experience will be like, the experience that the person has who's providing support, whether it be spiritual, therapeutic, just general support, risk reduction, what is the substance they're taking if they're receiving, or knowing that the person isn't going to provide a substance, that they have to test it themselves, that they need to do their own medical screening, or that they've agreed that they've given all information necessary for medical screening. All these things are important for the participant, and in a way, I think, is part of the journey. to know it's almost integration on the front end. It's like, okay, I'm preparing in this way. I need to know these things. It's helpful for me to understand coming into it. And of course, we all know you can't really know going into what's going to happen. But also someone saying that I'm not guaranteeing any kind of outcome. You may not feel anything. You may feel too much of something. I'm there to help. But, all that can be expressed, and in my mind is how I support both parties in the transaction, is making sure that everything is said that needs to be said.
Wow. This is great, because I want to ask about this. This comes up so much with people in my community, clients. And I think especially those of us that are not attorneys don't really understand where we can be protected versus not. So let's say, because we all know there's a lot of underground therapists and facilitators out there. They do not have churches. They're, let's say, just let's say the psychotherapist who's maybe offering some underground work, meaning not legally regulated within the confines of the law right now. And, I've been asked this multiple times over the years, like, can I have any protection? Like, can I give them a legal waiver to sign? And, I always say consult an attorney, but then I'm like, well, if it's illegal, is there any protection? And, yes, you can draw up as much as, like you can try, right? Like a really, like that, this is what I always say, get a really thorough medical intake, obviously lay out all the risks and all the, potentials of what could happen and have them sign off. But I'm wondering, are they protected? Because it's kind of this strange gray area. And, I think when I've interviewed a couple people from Chacruna, Joseph and Robert, and I forgot who said it, but one of them said, oh, the chances of getting in trouble is very slim. And I'm like, ooh, I don't know. That's kind of hard for me to hear.
So
yeah, what are the realities on this?
I do tell clients, what I'm hearing in the atmosphere. For a lot of churches, there hasn't been a lot. There haven't been many raids. It's mostly seizures of sacrament coming across the border. And I can say I haven't heard much, but I always say, you don't want to be the next test case, but you have to prepare to be the next test case. It's always a risk. These substances, unless you have a clear exemption, they're illegal and they may be enforced that way, federal or state, regardless of any decrim that is simply deprioritization. That doesn't mean they're not going to come after you if something horrendous happens. So with respect to the agreement, that's why I like to really think these things through with the practitioner of whatever kind of work they're doing, to see where they would have affirmative defenses. The religious side, it's obviously religious, the right to religious exercise. Something I'm exploring more for someone who's just providing a therapy is how to create an agreement that is enforceable. Ultimately, the more you touch the substance, the less legal it becomes, which is unfortunate because we also know that one of the big risks is the substance, whether it's been tampered with, if it's safe. A lot of the time, these therapists actually have the best source, but I have to say, do not source the substance for someone. If they, a lot of therapists have just opted to do prep and integration, so not the journey support work. And if that's the case, they can provide, an agreement, have the, it be certainly enforceable. They are not encouraging, aiding, abetting any of the inchoate crimes, where you're not actually doing the illegal thing, but maybe encouraging. And one of the words actually is, are you facilitating a crime? Which is funny because so many of these practitioners call themselves facilitators. I try to walk step by step and say, what's happening here? Maybe don't see them take the substance. Of course, it's good and again, it would be so much safer if they could help you go through a medical screening, knowing exactly what substance you're going to take. But the more knowledge you have, the more intent to violate the law or collaboration there is. So it's a really delicate balance. I will say that someone could argue that it's a legal activity, it shouldn't be enforced. But at the same time, you could very much argue that it was necessary for the person to be there to reduce the risk. That, both parties did agree to these terms. So I've been working really hard on creating something I think would be as enforceable as possible. And, I have my own rules about who I work with. Someone very experienced. I try not to start with anyone new. I'm somebody who refines somebody's practices, not creates their practices. So that's sort of my standard there. And then actually what's interesting is the issue of duty of care, which is more of a civil issue, right? So you've got criminal and you've got civil, which is when somebody files a lawsuit for breaching a duty of care or some kind of duty. So there's a lot of risk for the person trying to reduce the risk in all cases. And so I just want to honor all those people who are really out there risking everything. Even things like, there's the crack house statute that says that if you use a place for an illegal purpose that is doing controlled substances in that place, that's very illegal. And even these safe injection sites have been deemed to be a crack house. So a lot of efforts to engage in harm reduction are being criminalized in this moment, which is really disappointing, especially with this push. I mean, it's happening. It's happening regardless. It would be nice if there was, and there was just a decision when they said, the court said, with respect to the crack house statute, Congress needs to change this. It doesn't make sense. I mean, they said that in the opinion, because there's so much happening that's terrible, mental health crisis, addiction, PTSD for veterans, PTSD for just people trying to live in a really complex world. And there are these potential avenues for growth and healing and change. But the way that the legal system is set up right now, it's not permitting the regulation that's necessary. It's not permitting above ground work that would progress it even more and make it safer. We'd have less bad actors. They could be held accountable. They could be called out in public without the person who participated fearing they're disclosing that they engaged in illegal activity and will be penalized for that and judged for that. I think a lot of what I do is really also about education and information, because we have to educate. We have to provide information of what's been good, the good practitioners who've been underground and quiet and solid for decades. We don't hear about them. And we don't hear about the good experiences people have had in the ways it's benefited them in huge ways. And I like to say that, I've been in the depths of things, and different substances and different modalities, whether it be recreational, therapeutic, or spiritual, have helped me infinitely. I'm a mom of two. I've, got a lot on the line. I'm a lawyer, but this is important to talk about, because if we don't educate, it's going to remain as an outlier thing, as something that still is stigmatized. So
Oh my God. No, thanks for sharing. It's so interesting because it's like we can see the catch-22 here, which is like, well, it's actually safer if we create these safe, boundaries and the law and also best practices and hold people accountable. But then there's like just all these problems in the system. And of course, so many people are talking about this. And I think this is where people like you and the work you're doing is hopefully going to change things in the future. And I believe it's changing. But even the other day, I saw someone talk about microdosing, somewhere on the internet. And probably like you, to me, it's so harmless. And it's kind of like, to me, it's almost legal, even though it technically, like a microdose tincture of mushrooms or someone getting a little capsule with like 0.01 grams in there, like it seems so harmless, but technically it's still illegal in most places. And I'm wondering, have you seen over the years that there's kind of this scale of, well, it's more of a risk if you are pouring ayahuasca to a large group in an Airbnb that you rent versus you're sitting with someone doing a half a gram and a one-on-one in your living room. Is there, because that's kind of how it feels out there. It's like, oh, this is less risky versus the large group of people taking, I don't know, MDMA or drinking ayahuasca. Do you feel like there's like less of a risk or more of a risk?
That's really hard to chart. I will say so much goes to the practitioner and their experience level, which I think is really important. And I'm not dismissing someone who just drank ayahuasca or ate mushrooms and is like, I really feel compelled to serve. Great. But go apprentice, like find someone, beg if you need to, do it for free for a little bit. I don't know. But I really worry about the people who are practitioners. And even, in the places where now we have a regulated model, for example, in Oregon, these are individuals who get many, many hours of training. I believe it's 160. And some people ask, well, should it be someone with a medical license? Of course, that puts their licensure at risk, right? We don't know what their licensing board is saying. But it's like, you want a little bit of everything. You want someone who understands a health crisis, like really knows it, knows when it's just a bad, difficult experience, which can be worked within, and when it's a significant emergency. Someone who's also participated in that kind of experience before. I'm not trying to gatekeep, but obviously that's an important piece of knowledge. And then someone who does have training around how to support someone in that space. I mean, it's very separate experiences, but really have to synthesize in that moment when someone is having a difficult time or having a great time, but needs to work it. How do you then use that in a way that's beneficial? Not, I am the person who says that, I think every psychedelic experience is, at obviously differing times, recreational, therapeutic, and spiritual. Every experience. The question is, in what lane are you entering into that, right? Even if it's just communal and that's recreational, right? So to be with community, it doesn't have to be spiritual in that sense, but I think they all overlap and intermesh, and you need someone who can work with that and then also refer out, right? So if you're with a practitioner who's just sort of therapeutic and you're having a deep spiritual issue, can they reach out to someone who has that experience, who can support you? So I think all of them are risky, really. And that's
like a true lawyer.
Yeah, I sit and I look for risks.
But I'm glad you mentioned this because I coach some people who are, most of my clients are coaches or healers or therapists. I will actually not work with straight up facilitators because, first of all, I can't really teach you to market in a legal business. But second, I also have my personal boundaries. And, even my clients that maybe do some microdosing or small something with their clients that they're already developing a relationship with, I always err on the side of low risk or no risk at all, actually. But at the same time, I also agree with you is there's a lot to learn. This is not just, hey, move to Oregon and now you can give people mushrooms, which, I actually had someone trying to work with me who wanted to do this and I gave her money back. I said, I don't want to work with you because it was just, first of all, it was very disrespectful, but there was also, she wasn't seeing the whole vision of this is a human life and a soul and traumas and, it's not just hand someone a pill and voila, now they're better. It's deep work. So I definitely err on that side too. But it's an interesting world we're stepping into because now there's a facilitator on every corner. There's people who've been trained for 1 week versus 10 years. So there's people who've not been trained at all. It's definitely feeling Wild West. And,
Yes.
And like you said, we don't hear about a lot of the positive. I mean, we do hear some, but the second something terrible happens, it's all over at least the psychedelic world and maybe even potentially the mainstream. And even with the training in Oregon, that's been interesting because, I know some people involved in that over there and it's maybe not the full answer in itself either.
Right.
So I'm wondering, what is your view on where all of this is going? Are we heading in the right direction? It's just we're in this messy birth process, especially coming from the regulatory standpoint, the legal standpoint, the safety, the harm reduction, also best practices. I know about the North Star Agreement. I've seen some other, Chacruna has some that you helped write, right? But then it's still very Wild West. There's no governing board. There's not anything really regulated. I actually have heard 3 people who end up falling in love with their mushroom facilitator. I mean, I'm not kidding. Therapist, doctor, ketamine doctor and patient are now together. Someone, fell in love with their mushroom facilitator and now they're together. I mean, which, by the way, who am I to say what's right or wrong?
Yeah.
But what do you feel like is going on now with this Wild West, and are we heading in the right direction?
I think some people are heading in the right direction. It's hard to manage because it's incredibly exciting. I mean, if you follow what's happening in the psychedelic space, the excitement is intoxicating, really. So I understand people are getting very enthusiastic, and we should be enthusiastic, but we also have to take small measured steps. And maybe that's the person identifying risk constantly in me speaking, but also realizing, one, it's really important to call out bad actors and maybe not, definitely specifically, because people should know this person is dangerous, right? That's good. And I think there is a lot of social media groups that help with that. But I think I had someone say to me last weekend when I was at Chacruna's Queering Psychedelics conference, and I absolutely loved this, that ethics don't exist if there's no accountability. And I was talking to this person about Sacred Plant Alliance, which is where, and speaking of births, is where I birthed my 3rd baby, which was the RFRA guide. I spent about 8 months working on it. And it was actually right after I had my son. So I was deep in the hormones. But I talk a lot about best practices. Of course, the law is important, how it's protecting spiritual work that is sincere. But the other portion of the test is whether it's safe. And I've really dived into that because I want to enable people who are doing the right thing the right way. So Sacred Plant Alliance is where we have an association of churches. We've been working together since 2020 and sharing information. And it was really beautiful because it became a community of communities. It was all these facilitators who had at least 7, 10, 20 years under their belt, like really experienced churches in the United States, talking about adverse events and how they repaired after it, talking about emergencies, sharing emergency procedures, sharing their medical disclosure forms and informed consent agreements, all of us working together to figure out how to improve them. It's been amazing. And being the attorney who was showing up, I obviously went a little crazy and took over. And so now I'm president there. But I've also got the privilege of being able to identify myself publicly, where a lot of these people don't. But we've developed ethical guidelines, very, very long ethical guidelines, and we have an ethical reporting system. So each community shares, when they share each event, a little blurb at the bottom. I'm a member of Sacred Plant Alliance. We have ethical standards, and if you feel that there's been a breach of those standards, or there was an adverse event that we didn't handle well, or an emergency, please use this link to file a report with Sacred Plant Alliance. And then we offer mediation, which is...
This is amazing. It's like the solution to everything, right?
I hope.
Accountability.
It creates self-governing accountability because, as I said, there's no way to create that above ground in the moment. I guess this is above ground. But it creates also confidentiality and anonymity outside of the circle. We do obviously have mandatory reporting provisions, which is, if it's a minor, if it's someone who's disabled, obviously I don't kind of wonder why they're in the ceremony, but in some circumstances it may make sense. In some religious practices it may make sense. We do have a no sexual activity rule, which I had taken a long time to figure out how to articulate why. Actually, querying psychedelics helped me a lot. There was conversations about kink and psychedelics, about consent, about power dynamics. And I think what we can see by looking outside of the spiritual use to the therapy model, there's a rule. You do not engage in sexual activity or relationships with your patient because you cannot escape that power dynamic. The person who is serving you, supporting you, they are familial in a lot of ways. You are so vulnerable. I mean, we know psychedelics make you vulnerable and open. And that's a perfect place to shift bad habits, to try and heal trauma. But it also makes you incredibly pliable. As you said, relationships develop. And maybe that's right, but have you then really considered how much power that person had in the moment? And is it okay? And I find that in a spiritual context, we can't. There's just, and once you're taking a psychedelic, you are altered. You are in a non-ordinary state of consciousness. At that point, could you revoke consent? And if you can't say, I was able to revoke consent, I'm not sure you gave it in the first place. And I think that's shown in, a person who's very drunk, right? And they decide to engage in sexual activity. If they're so drunk that they can't have revoked consent, the courts have said there was no consent. So I do a lot of my ethical analysis based on some laws. And I think that's been very helpful, but also talking to really amazing, experienced people who are thinking about how do we navigate this with integrity in an ethical way, especially in this infancy stage where every bad case is going to affect public perception of what we're doing. And so I say, we're a community of communities. protect the other communities.
That's exactly it. I'm so glad you said that, because this has actually been my number one concern. It's like, yes, I feel sad to hear about abuse with one person or a certain experience, but then it's like it tampers the whole potentiality that we have to bring this to more people, to make it a safe environment for, my mom to go have an experience, And I always look at the larger picture of, the bad apples, which to me are definitely in the minority. It's just we hear about them more, the abuse or the shaman or the sexual case. I mean, we've all heard them. But then it's kind of like, what is it doing to the larger movement? And that's where I actually, now that MDMA is becoming legalized for therapeutic use, that's actually one of my biggest concerns is, MDMA out of all the medicines is very easy to fall in love with people. Especially your hot single therapist. I get it.
Art expert. Yeah. It's intoxicating, right? Yeah, it is scary to think about that effect, but if we don't talk about it, I think it's worse. But what I'd like to see more is people being able to talk about their good experiences. But the best practitioners I know will not talk publicly. I'm not saying there aren't very good ones who are public, have a website, are doing interviews. But I'd say 99% of the clients that I have do not publicly identify what they're doing, and they ask their participants not to talk about what they're doing. Obviously, in the case of a problem, they should, but they don't even want you to talk about the good stuff, right? Because they're trying to protect themselves because of the way the law is developed. So we're in this really contradictory space where, and even if you look, the government asks that you're protecting the health and safety of participants when you do a religious use or the right to religious use analysis. But how can you prove that if the government has made that almost impossible? You can't test. You can't source from where you want to. You can't call emergency services without worrying that you're going to get arrested. It's a dilemma for the practitioner to do the right thing. It's a rock and a hard place for sure. But I'm very grateful that my experience thus far has been with good practitioners. I've been very fortunate, and I think a lot of it has been my involvement with Sacred Plant Alliance. I've met some of the best, and they refer me to people. So I've gotten into like a good crew. I'm very lucky. But yeah, it's a little scary. And I do wonder a lot of the time about what I'm doing. And I have to stop and pause and think about, who am I helping? What am I enabling? Am I doing the right thing? And I've definitely sat in a ceremony and been like, "Ooh, I have to really think about this." But for me, psychedelics have been such a beautiful part of my experience. Even the hard experiences have been beautiful. I'm fortunate that I've been able to integrate as much as I can and had such good medicines and ultimately, also my identity as a white individual. I've been very, very fortunate. But we have to then think about people with less privilege, people who really do need the access. How do we get that to them as soon as possible, if that's what they want, right?
Yeah, access is huge, and it has been brought up so much in this podcast. It's a constant issue. I even did the math where I was like, well, in order to be like even a legal above ground psychedelic therapist, it's unfortunately the model doesn't quite work very well, meaning like the therapist needs to make money and survive. And then it's the only way to do that is to charge a lot, because you can't see 6 clients a day or 8, like a traditional talk or somatic therapist. I mean, it's a strange world, but I have a question about what you just said. So I wanted to know if the Sacred Plant Alliance is only for legal churches, and then also if you're, let's say, a small, individuals hosting groups in your home, and let's say they're just small, like you're, not like a huge church yet. How hard is it for like the everyday person to go and establish a legal medicine church? Is it really a big pain in the butt, like I've heard?
I want it to be a pain in the butt.
Yeah, well, that's true, right?
So first question, establish a legal church. Let's walk that back. You may be a church that has a legal entity. You still only have an affirmative defense. So in the RFRA guide, I said, what's the difference between being legal and defensible? Unless you have an exemption from the DEA, if you possess or distribute a substance that is a controlled substance, it is illegal federally. On state level too. So, super important to realize what you're getting into. I know there are people who phrase it differently. I would discourage you from believing it. As I said, I always tell my clients, you could be the next test case. So that was adorable. So you can be established as a legal entity. I don't think that would be dispositive, meaning would makes the court say, oh yeah, you're definitely a church, or, oh, you're not incorporated at state level. You haven't gotten your 501c3. You're not a church. The whole point is that there's a separation of church and state, which is why churches are nonprofits. They can't be taxed. And it's why actually, without even incorporating or as a church, which is, something incorporated, or you can actually be a nonprofit LLC in some circumstances, but I feel like that's less churchy. And without getting an IRS determination letter saying you're a church, you can say, I'm a church. You can raise that defense in court. Does it look better? A little bit, right? If you have your sacrament being mailed to a church name at their address, safer in your defense, right? Gives you more evidence. You've been operating as a church, identifying your beliefs, you have a congregation, which is what the IRS requires for you to file as a 501c3. That's, of course, looking to mainstream church criteria. I like to hope that we could argue something that is a little more of an outlier model in the future, but for your best defense. And I'm not saying do it because the law says so. So I'm just saying, if you want the best defense, these are the ways a court will analyze. And that's sort of what I've been doing, is saying, here's how you would have your best defense based on precedent set, based on the way religion has been analyzed in courts and is analyzed by your state and is, provided by the IRS. You can use these criteria. Right? You can use this to refine what you're already doing, like articulate it in the way that the government will best understand it so they can relate to it, right? So with respect to SPA, right, not launching into, we are not legal churches, right? We actually have been talking to some of the churches who do have legal exemptions about them joining us and sharing their perspective and what does a DEA audit look like, which is really interesting, actually. I've gotten a lot of insight into that. But we just want to see certain things that for us signify sincerity and safety. For me, those are the two big ones. And basically that looks like operations that have accountability within your structure. So governance, right? Does the leader have to speak to a group about their, compensation? And that's a requirement as a nonprofit, that you have a board deciding how much someone receives. And if that person is on the board, they recuse themselves for that conversation. They don't say, right? So there are these little pieces of corporate law that I think actually, they're called like fiduciary duties. It's loyalty. It's, basically the things that I want to see someone have anyway with respect to their community, their spiritual community. And it's in the law. It's right there. So I like to, I'm a lawyer, so I like it. But I like to see it. It feels good to me. And it's what I advise. But Sacred Plant Alliance doesn't require that you be incorporated. We just want to see you have a community, you have some kind of accountability within your own system. You are using medical disclosure, even if it's psilocybin and there are very few contraindications. We know there are problem issues, right, with certain medications or herbs or substances or a mental health crisis. If you're in it in the moment, you should ask somebody, have you been in a mental health crisis in the last 2 months? So at least know it and be able to address it. But also maybe now is not the time for your ceremony. So, for a lot of churches, I say, do a long form when someone first joins your community, and then do check-ins. Like before each ceremony, be like, is there anything you need to update me on? Whether it's medications, the FDA approved medications are wonky too, right? So we need to know everything you're taking. There are some amazing medical practitioners who have been willing to risk their licensure to talk to churches or even be part of churches to help with medical screening. So all that's important. Informed consent, is very dear to my heart for a variety of reasons, but also protects the church, which is important. Risk is inherent. One in, I don't know the numbers, but like 1 in a million, there's going to be someone who, even if you do everything right, something terrible could happen. And it may not be the church's fault at all. Should the parents be able to sue the church for that? So that's
that MAPS case that just came through was
really
intense.
But and I'm not going to comment on the case, but I am going to say the standard that they used in that case, which I've read very, very thoroughly, of course, was a reasonable person standard, right? And the question was, did a reasonable person do what they should have done in that set of circumstances? And the jury found that they had it, that someone should have checked on her more and called emergency services sooner. I think that's the same allegation in the Soul Quest wrongful death case, was emergency services should have been called sooner. And I'm not trying to influence anyone in any way, but also, are they a reasonable person, or should that person be more skilled than a reasonable person and have known for sure that this was an emergency? So I'm not hoping that the courts take on that standard, but I am hoping that people take on that responsibility, because these are lives, right? I mean, and then just the trauma to the whole group. I mean, it's just, somebody. So it's heavy. It's important. There is a lot that someone takes on in this space. And I also hope that they're taking care of themselves, because I know there's issues with boundaries, even with participants breaching those boundaries. And are you taking time to integrate and protect yourself and replenish after such deep support work? I think a lot of people are so excited about the industry. It's go, 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 myself included.
But like, who is it? There was someone I interviewed where we were like, okay, it's okay if we slow this train down a little to try to get it a little more right, instead of, because it's like you said, there's so many people who experience the healing benefits and then have these epiphanies and are like, oh my God, I want to just give it to my friends and family and share this with the world. But I agree. It's like, and even, this case or even the 2 cases you were just talking about, it's interesting. It's like, this is in place for harm reduction. But, I did the MAPS, the Zendo training at Burning Man. It was at Burning Man. And I'm glad I did it. It was better than nothing. But, does it make me capable at that high level to know exactly what to do if someone's on the edge of maybe death and I'm not trained in medical, and it's interesting because during that case, I was like, well, this could completely take down this idea of having these harm reduction little centers set up at festivals or events, or so we could get rid of it completely. Or, we take this risk and something happens and it's just no one's trained enough. And I mean, it's a weird world. And I think we're probably going to run into this more and more over the years, especially as, this just grows in popularity. But I think it's like you said, education, discernment, having more information. I love the accountability of this plant alliance. Like just having that in itself is huge to have, a place where someone can go and make an anonymous, a call out where it is self-regulated, because there is no other regulation. And I think this is amazing what you guys are doing. And I'm so thankful for you and everybody who's doing that work, because this might be or might have to become the model for a while for other, maybe for other areas of this underground world, until we hopefully figure it all out. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder, I'm like, are we going to figure this out? I don't know.
I mean, we have to. And I remember when I was first talking to my husband, I was like very deeply feeling into some of the allegations of abuse in the space. And he said, this isn't a psychedelics problem. It's a human problem. We see it with teachers and students. We see it, I've experienced that in a really horrible way before. We've seen it with therapists and their patients. We're all human, and that doesn't excuse it. It actually requires us to address it. There are people who have ego, may not even see they're doing anything wrong. People need to call it out, of course. But yeah, we're building the plane while we're on it. But I also think there are so many people who are doing the right thing right now that when it is the time, people can talk about it, and that's going to help a lot. So, I like to say I remain optimistic and somewhat naive. But I
probably a good place to sit.
Yeah.
I get it. It's a dance. I go through this myself, and I'm not even as entrenched as you are. And there's days where I'm like, do I even want to be a part of this? Because, there's every other week there's something. I mean, and it's, I generally am an optimist. I do believe there's more positive than negative happening. And it's just the negative is usually so jarring that it's, everybody talks about it right away and it spreads like wildfire. But then how many of the amazing, positive, healing, life-changing stories are spreading like wildfire every day? Maybe not as much. But Allison, it was so amazing to have you on. I want you to be able to share what is it you have coming up? I know you're probably busy. You have your hands in 20,000 different things. And, I'm curious because I'm sure I'm going to get this question. Are you for hire? Because I have been asked for attorneys probably like a few hundred times in the last few years. It's, and I'm like, just look at my podcast. But, because I know people are going to be like, I need to talk to her. Yeah. What is going on with you and your work?
Yeah. So I've returned to solo practice at my firm, Hoots Law Practice. I'm very busy. I'm also president of a nonprofit that's fundraising and starting to accept new memberships. And so we are incredibly underwater there, but with excitement and a lot of joy. But yeah, I've recently started to create, I've been joking, it's my mycelium network of attorneys. I now am working with Sean McAllister in Colorado and California, and there are a couple other lawyers I'm partnering with in different states, so I can have more breadth in the way I can provide support. I'm definitely a couple months out at the moment. But, I think there are some things I could address sooner. It is a juggle. But coming up, I'm going to be at MAP Psychedelic Science. I'm doing a half-day workshop on the Tuesday about psychedelic churches and their legality with Sean McAllister and Bia Labache. And I'm also going to be on a panel for Sacred Plant Alliance with Rob Heffernan and Bob Stanley. And I'm also on another panel with Jack Silver, who was the attorney in the Santo Daime case, and Martha Hartney, who is a brilliant attorney in Colorado, with, I think, Ismail Ali is the moderator, or maybe it was Sean McAllister. So I've got 2 panels there. I'm also going to be at Psychedelic, which is in Philadelphia, which is where I went to law school. I'm really excited to go back, which is a UPenn sponsored psychedelics conference. I think that's as far as I could think ahead right now. But yeah, and you can email me. I respond to everyone.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, and take calls with everyone, unfortunately.
I'll just forward you all the emails I get. Yeah. No, I'm kidding.
Talk to people. And honestly, it's the way in which I keep learning and understanding the needs and the problems. And yeah, it's community.
So good. Yeah. And I think this is why I appreciate you coming on, because honestly, most of the questions that people have could be answered in this interview. Because it's a lot of the questions I even have, where it's like I recently went through, a case. It's a personal case where it was like a client therapist thing. And I was like, wait, what are the rules around this? Like, I just knew it was something you're not supposed to do. And that was all I knew. And then it was interesting to see, the various responses. And, and that's where I was like, well, this is interesting. We need to just be educated, especially as more and more people go into this facilitation space or even microdosing, whatever it is. So Allison, this was amazing. I can't wait. I am going to Psychedelic Science myself, and I will see you at your panels. I know she knows I was debating.
Yes.
Making a vacation out of it.
Find each other, because it's going to be insane.
Crazy.
But great education, information, great meeting of the minds and minds and minds and minds. And that's a good thing. It's the more we share. Someone said to me also recently, and I just adored this, that we're smarter together. Mm-hmm. Don't try to get to the front of the line, like stand and hold hands and share and acknowledge when you don't know and bring in someone else. And let's all work together on this, because that's how it's going to move forward.
Thank you so much for being here. This was such an honor. So good. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you're feeling inspired, I'd appreciate it if you showed your love with a review. And check out my YouTube channel, where you can find the video version of this podcast. You can also head to BethAWeinstein.com to learn more about me and grab my free business growth trainings. Remember, you carry your own unique medicine, and your medicine is what we need for these times.